Hi, and welcome to This Week in Audit, for all of your audit news in under 5 minutes. This week is a jam-packed show with a huge range of stories, both from here in Australia and abroad. Our first news item this week is in regards to fees paid for illegal activities in overseas countries. Now, this story comes out of a range of different events that have been occurring, but the biggest one in our news has been the attempted abduction of 2 children in Lebanon by their Australian mother. It's claimed that Channel 9 and 60 Minutes had paid fees for this illegal activity. There are also claims that Channel 9 have paid fees to release the journalists in question from prison in Lebanon. So how do we account for those sorts of activities? And this also came up this week in the CMFEU, which is a construction workers union here in Australia, where they were instructed to pay almost $1 million in fines. What happens to fines and fees for illegal activities within the accounts? Do we simply have a line that says bribery expense or illegal activity expense? Typically these amounts are likely to be immaterial from a dollar perspective, but are qualitatively quite important. So appropriate accounting and then audit recognition of those is critical. Our second piece of news this week comes from Alice Springs, which is in the centre of Australia. So how do people get away with this sort of fraud over an extended period of time? Let's look at the fraud triangle. Remember, there is the incentive to commit fraud, or the pressure. Number 2, there is the opportunity to engage in fraud, and that could be because of a failure of internal controls or oversight. And number 3, the attitude or rationalization of the person in question in regards to fraud. Now, in relation to the case in Alice Springs, certainly there was incentive or pressure. The person in question was addicted to gambling. And number 2, it looks like there was also a lack of internal controls that allowed the accountant to steal money from the accounts of community organisations. So it's important for companies to make sure that they have good policies and procedures in place, not only to make sure that everybody is doing the right thing, but also to minimise the risk of fraud. We've already had one fuel tampering scandal in the last 12 months, with Volkswagen having been found to have falsified fuel emissions data, and it's now happened to a second car manufacturer. Last week it was announced that Mitsubishi has been falsifying fuel and emissions data for at least a decade, possibly longer than that. So we are waiting to find out about investigations to determine the fallout from this. Certainly there will be fines potentially on the cards for these firms, and also accounting for those fines is critical. Even though those fines may be, again, immaterial, certainly as an auditor I would be looking at disclosure of those items appropriately in the notes to the accounts. Often these issues point to larger concerns for the auditor surrounding management integrity. So even though these are only small in dollar value, qualitatively they may be quite a strong signal. Another piece of news this week that is certainly a signal is the decision by the Vatican to let go PricewaterhouseCoopers. PwC was assisting the Vatican with financial reforms. Obviously the Vatican exists as its own entity and has its own sets of financial statements. No specific reason was given. There was no implication that PwC is perhaps doing a poor job, but the Vatican has decided that reflection and contemplation is the way to solve their financial woes. Whether this means accountants will be reflecting, or priests in general in relation to the financial statements, maybe their reflection might involve some accounting study. And our very last piece of news this week is the warning by the PCAOB, which is the regulatory body overseeing auditors within the United States, that they are warning auditors in regards to altering work paper documentation from audits after those audits have been completed, especially in the instance where the SEC or the PCAOB may be investigating those auditors as part of a larger investigation. Now, why is it important to keep appropriate documentation? I always tell my students that I can't remember what I had for breakfast 2 weeks ago, and if you ask me in court about an audit, I might not remember a decision I made 7 years ago, potentially, about an audit. So documentation of objectives, of evidence, of justifications and conclusions is critical within audit work papers. Here in Australia, ASA 220 clearly says that we need to document our work papers appropriately. In a similar vein, the Australian government has made it illegal to alter or falsify an accounting document, and it has become a criminal act. So certainly we're trying to minimise the risk that organisations engage in fraud by falsifying or altering documents. So that's all the news that we have this week. It was certainly jam-packed. I look forward to seeing you all next week. If there's anything that comes up in the news, make sure you tag me on Twitter or send me an email and I will try and get to it next week. Otherwise, happy auditing, everybody.